The United States and China are fighting for influence across the world, and this is one battle that the Chinese are winning. Over the past 12 months, we have seen titanic shifts happening. Strategic American partners like Saudi Arabia are moving away, drifting closer towards China, while a string of G7 allies, including Germany and France, are making trips to Beijing to build trade relations. And the big question is why? Is it really because of China's rising economy? Well, the real answer lies within the US. America's failures aren't directly tied to Beijing, but really lies with how Washington conducts itself. You see, American foreign policy is a different beast on its own, and it's all about staying as the world's unipolar power. Now, in the early 1990s, the Department of Defense created a set of principles that was leaked to the New York Times. It was called the Wolfowitz Doctrine and gives us an insider's look into how America views itself on the world stage. And pay attention to these 2 points because they reveal a lot about how US approaches its foreign and economic policies. The first is America's superpower status, and the doctrine states how America is to be the world's only remaining superpower, and the first objective is to prevent the re-emergence of a new rival. In this case, the closest rival America has is China. And the second point is maintaining US primacy, and this states how the US must protect a world order that holds the promise of convincing potential competitors that they need not aspire to a greater role. That means writing the rules and controlling the infrastructure to remain number one. And a great example is the US dollar and how the world is dependent on the dollar system to function. And this document received such an outcry that it had to be rewritten. But there are disturbing parallels to what's going on today in the world. Now, while following the doctrine helped the US maintain power thus far, the world has reached a turning point and countries are kind of getting smarter. America's strategy is starting to backfire and the old playbook isn't working as effectively as before. Now, there are three strategic errors that the United States keeps making on the world stage, and unless they correct this, China will always pull out ahead and eventually win the race. Now, the first mistake America keeps making is focusing too much on China. And this is a classic error that the US keeps making somehow. Instead of concentrating on what America has to offer the world, they keep trying to discredit China, which isn't working well. We can see this with Blinken's recent trip to Tonga. During the visit, Blinken warned the Pacific nation of predatory Chinese aid. He told Tonga that help from Beijing often comes with strings attached, and China has increasingly problematic behavior. Now, this is nothing new. America has done this in many visits to countries around the world. However, this strategy just puts the United States on the back foot and places China high up on the pedestal. You are essentially enshrining China as the superior power that you are trying to catch up with, that you are trying to bring down. Even the headlines are all about the US trying to counter China in the Pacific and not about how America can help Tonga build its economy. However, when China visited Tonga in 2022, the conversation was all about cooperation. The two countries signed deals on disaster relief, agriculture, and healthcare. The conversation didn't revolve around the United States. China couldn't care less. In fact, the King of Tonga mentioned how facts prove that Chinese friendship has always been based on deeds rather than words. And this is one example of why China is winning the diplomacy battle. They focus on what the other country wants and then they deliver. China doesn't steer the conversation towards discrediting or countering America. There's really no need to do so. It's like constantly talking to your clients about competitor. The more you talk about them, the more curious your clients become until one day they decide to take their business away from you and go with your competitor. What America should do is to focus on what they can provide to each country and then deliver. An easy win is to provide more access to dollars to emerging markets. And by now, we know the importance of the US dollar in the global economy. The dollar makes up the majority of foreign exchange reserves in the world, sitting comfortably at 59%. Countries hold a ton of dollars because the majority of exports like commodities are priced in the reserve currency. Whether it's wheat, oil, or copper, you need dollars to import resources to run and grow your economy. However, the majority of countries do not have free access to US dollars, and that is a big problem. In 2022, the Federal Reserve hiked interest rates to fight inflation. However, that triggered a wave of currency devaluations across the world. The currencies of emerging economies were dropping 10, 20, or even 30% against the dollar. and that meant that local inflation flew up and they had to spend more money to import vital commodities like food and energy. In fact, the United Nations mentioned how the world is facing a double burden today of high food prices and a strong US dollar. Since the Federal Reserve started hiking rates plus the war in Ukraine, food prices have been soaring and the dollar has been rising, and this hurts many nations around the world. The stronger the dollar becomes, the bigger the burden it is for developing countries to import food. And this is where America can take the lead and really help the world. They could allow emerging economies to access more US dollars by establishing more dollar swap lines. And a swap line will allow these countries to swap their local currency for US dollars, giving them more access to the reserve currency. However, there's a big problem. America is kind of stingy with issuing new swap lines. If we look at the standing swap lines the United States has with the world, there's only a handful of countries on that list. This includes Canada, the UK, the Eurozone, and Japan. And these countries are closely allied with America and part of the G7 group. It gets immediately apparent when we zoom out and take a look at the world map. The majority of recipients aren't in the emerging economies. Most of Asia and Africa are excluded. This is where China takes the lead once again. Beijing has yuan swap line agreements with over 41 countries, with the total amount exceeding $550 billion worth. And this includes countries like Argentina, which is facing a horrible inflation crisis and a US dollar shortage. While China might have a bigger agenda to de-dollarize the world, they are helping Argentina to tide through their crisis by allowing them to easily access Chinese goods. But here's the $1 trillion question. Why doesn't America freely give out their swap lines? Well, it's because they love to mix foreign policy with economics, which is quite counterproductive. When China brokered a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, there was a big clue within the joint statement that tells us why Beijing is winning. That is the non-interference in the internal affairs of states. Basically, China doesn't care how you run your country. They just want to do business and improve each other's economy, plain and simple. While trying to export democracy might be a good strategy to win votes at home, it's a very messy affair for the rest of the world. But that's not all. A big reason why America is on a back foot is not treating other countries equally. In a recent interview, the Algerian president told the world about his experience with China. According to him, China treats all countries equally, regardless of size. And this is an important statement because every country, big or small, has to be respected and treated equally on the world stage. China rolls out the red carpet for countries like Honduras with all the pomp and pageantry available. It's the exact same treatment that bigger nations like France receive as well. While you might say it's superficial and a grand waste of time, it is a show of China's commitment to building stronger relations. However, this is one area that America is still lacking in. One clear example is Biden's infamous trip to Saudi Arabia. After meeting with MBS and the Saudi king, Biden expected the kingdom to pump more oil to bring down inflation. But we know what happened. Instead of pumping more oil, the Saudis actually cut production by 2 million barrels a day. In response, Biden vowed consequences for Saudi Arabia that isn't treating another country as equals. In fact, it caused the Crown Prince to threaten economic costs to the United States if Biden actually retaliated against the oil cuts. And if America wants to retain the respect of the world, they need to give respect as well. In contrast, China's 8-point diplomatic philosophy clearly points out how Beijing views the world. All countries, big or small, should be treated equally and respect each other. No country should bully others on a basis of strength. America has to come to the table as equals and put themselves in the shoes of others. And while we all pray for China and America to improve their relations, things are just spiraling out of control. In a shocking report by Bloomberg, more Americans view China as the enemy as trust dwindles. The Pew Research Center found an incredible 83% of Americans had an unfavorable view of China. Since 2017, US opinion of Beijing has gone from bad to worse. It has gone from under 50% to 83%. And this is very problematic towards building peace and cooperation, especially if China is always labeled as the boogeyman. And here's how crazy it gets. 50% of all Americans polled say that China is the greatest threat to the United States. That's more than Russia and North Korea combined. I just have to emphasize that all these are just polls, but it highlights the general sentiment Washington has against Beijing. There is a big worry in the world that we are heading towards a Thucydides trap, and that is a situation where a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, which eventually leads to a violent clash. Thucydides recorded that is the reason for the Peloponnesian War. It was the rise of Athens and the fear that instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable. In this case, the ruling power is the United States, while the rising power is China. Now, the numbers aren't good for everyone. A study by Harvard found that in 12 out of 16 times when a rising power confronted a ruling power, the result was war. But that doesn't have to be the case. There were instances where a great power shift happened peacefully. Such was the case when the United States displaced the UK, the United Kingdom, as the world's economic and military power. There was no war, and it was somewhat of a peaceful transition. Instead of competing with China, America should work together with Beijing to shape a new global order because it's obviously going to be very different from the unipolar order of the past 100 years. Now, I want to highlight that not all is lost, there's always hope, and I want to leave us with a powerful quote by the late US President JFK. Let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. JFK understood that peaceful coexistence is possible and it is needed, especially when we are talking about two economic and nuclear powers. During the Cold War, he managed to put himself in the shoes of the Soviets to avoid a nuclear Armageddon, and it's what the world desperately needs between China and the United States today, and hopefully that is what we will get. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Why is America losing the diplomacy race to China? And can both countries peacefully coexist together? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.